The story began in a courtroom where a young blonde woman named Inez was accused of murdering her husband, something she categorically refused to admit. The meeting itself resembled a theater, where all those present initially only planned to prove her guilt. The witnesses who spoke were categorically opposed to the accused, recalling various episodes that indirectly confirmed Inez's involvement in the crime. The townspeople reproached the blonde for her constant dissatisfaction with her husband and her plans to settle scores with him, which she allegedly expressed out loud. There were also those who recalled intimate details that proved Inez's involvement in one or another shameful sins, in the fact that the girl leads an immoral lifestyle. There were also other witnesses who spoke about the day when everything happened. They described what and where Inez bought and where she was going. Their last day with her husband was analyzed down to the smallest detail: their route, behavior, and where the couple was last seen together. The girl's path was reconstructed from the words of eyewitnesses, from which it followed that Inez climbed the mountain with her husband and then hastily descended alone. Everyone unanimously repeated as a fact that this woman killed her husband, and Inez stood on her knees and thought about why they were all telling lies. After all, she loved her partner and was happy with him. Why would she commit such a wild act while on excellent terms with the deceased? Over and over again, the woman repeated one thing: that she was not guilty of Joseph's murder, that she had nothing to do with it. Over and over again, Inez Benoa looked into the faces of her accusers and tirelessly insisted that she was not involved in this terrible crime. But the court was cruel and unshakable. It pronounced a guilty verdict in the case, which means that for society, the unfortunate widow became a cold-blooded killer who burned the body of her own husband. And it was the holy court of the water goddess Hecrasia, with the blow of the hammer of which Inez's life changed forever. According to the indictment, the woman was sentenced to 30 years in prison in Romfield. Hearing the words of the arbitrator, the crowd present in the hall raised a frantic howl of jubilation and began to insult and humiliate the devastated and unhappy widow in every way. Romfield was not just a dungeon, but a real hellish inferno. The prisoners were fed like stray dogs, leaving scraps and leftovers of the lowest quality. The prisoners were also forced to work in the quarry, which took the last of their strength. Fear, pain, and hopelessness reigned in this place, where death no longer seemed something terrible, but rather became a welcome rest. Not only did human flesh wither here, but the very nature of the human soul seemed to dissolve in this endless cycle of torture. But Inez continued to cling to life every day. So 10 years passed, until one day the prison guard read unexpected news in the latest newspaper. On the front page, it was written that the new emperor would grant pardon to prisoners and convicts in honor of his ascension to the throne. According to the order of the new monarch, Inez Benoa was pardoned and received the long-awaited freedom. Emaciated, with a tormented body and a bleeding soul, she looked at the daytime sun, which she could now see at will, and did not believe her happiness. On the threshold of the prison, she turned around at the call, still trying to recover from this news. The guard approached the former prisoner and handed her a letter. The guy said that it was given by a girl who called herself Inez's maid. With trembling hands, the woman took the envelope in her hands, its thin paper bent so unusually under her fingers, accustomed to a rough pickaxe and cold, rough walls. Inez thanked the jailer named Homer, because he really was a normal and quite adequate person. Holding the letter in her hand, the woman once again looked at her gloomy abode, in which she had spent so many years, as if something would not let her go. Benoa decided not to hesitate and immediately opened the envelope. The old, long-forgotten emotions already began to appear on her face. This letter was written by Susan, who worked in the Svenden house. How good it is when, despite all the difficulties and disasters, there are people in the world who remember you. But with each line read, Inez's face became more and more gloomy, and the world around began to plunge into darkness, as if twilight had fallen. In the letter, the maid spoke about the death of a person close and dear to the prisoner. Susan told the girl about the sudden death of her beloved mother, who never waited for her daughter to return from the stone dungeons of Romfield. In addition, it was said that the Benoa family had virtually ceased to exist, since Inez's father committed suicide, holding out for many years, but never being able to cope with the tragedy that befell their family. Having escaped from one hell, the girl found herself in another, in which her relatives left this world, and the reason for this was that terrible court verdict handed down 10 years ago. And even Susan, who retained her memory, blamed Inez for all the family's troubles, and said that it was all her fault, and that now she had nowhere to return, since she was left alone. Distraught with grief, the woman plunged into some strange state of semi-oblivion, where the full horror of the events that took place appeared before her. Pain squeezed her throat, and a tight lump rolled up, and the thought flashed through her head that it would be better if she lived in prison for another 10 years. But her family would be alive. Inez was brought out of this state by an extraneous noise, and since over the years she had become accustomed to overcoming difficulties of any nature, the woman got up and went to meet him. And even though her soul was devastated again, there was still strength in her body, and the former prisoner ran. The girl headed along the nearest path straight into the deep forest, trying to drive away bad thoughts and hide from the horrors of reality pursuing her. Screaming and crunching, not making out the road, Inez made her way through the thickets, breaking random branches along the way and moving on. Suddenly she saw the source of the noise and, involuntarily screaming, stopped. A beam of bright light cut through the forest gloom and rose high above the trees, framed by dark green foliage. In some crazy impulse, the woman began to walk further, no longer looking at her feet, and without taking her eyes off this phenomenon. Suddenly her leg caught on a tree root, and the freed convict flew to the ground. Inez managed to put her hands forward and soften the fall. However, the blow turned out to be very painful and made her remember the years spent in captivity. But this time was not in vain. Her body learned a serious lesson, and therefore, having fallen, she immediately came to her senses. The girl looked and did not dare to blink. She tried to absorb every moment of what she saw, because she had been deprived of all this for so long. A large blue lake appeared before the former convict, with turquoise tints and ripples on the surface sparkling in the sun. The dazzling picture clearly contrasted with everything that her eyes had seen for the last 10 years. It was unexpected and unusual. Inez calmed down a little and was filled with determination, because now she was an experienced woman who had seen so much that it would be enough for more than one lifetime. Tired eyes eagerly looked at the calming surface of the lake, and thoughts flashed in my head about what had been lost forever. Without taking off her shoes, Inez began to go into the water, remembering the words of the goddess of the water element, Hecrasia. The deity said that those who want a lot will ultimately receive nothing, and this phrase swirled in the head of the unfortunate girl like a deadly whirlwind. Repeating the words, "They will get nothing," the woman went further and further into the water. Having plunged deep enough into the cool abyss, Benoa felt a certain surge of peace and tranquility, so that her lips parted in a smile. The determination to stop everything here and now, giving herself into the arms of Hecrasia, obscured the whole world, and the girl, taking the last step, began to plunge into the depths. However, Inez's body, unlike her mind, was not ready for such an early ending. Having lost support under her feet and with a lack of oxygen, completely different thoughts began to visit her, more down to earth and pragmatic. And while the girl sank further and further, she wanted to live more and more, namely to breathe. Finally, the final idea formed inside that it was stupid and reckless to suffer for 10 years and then go and drown yourself. And suddenly Inez heard a voice in her head that said that she should give everything to the one who extended his hand and asked her to walk 10 steps. Of course, it was Hecrasia herself, but the woman did not believe the words of the elements and only doomedly continued her dive. Gathering her last strength, the unfortunate woman stretched out her hand to the light, to the air, and to the surface, which was moving away from her with every second. But arguing with the gods is a pointless idea. They know much more than we do, and therefore at the last moment, a strong man's hand grabbed Inez. The drowned woman only felt how quickly the light began to approach, and everything around her began to change. It was a young unknown guy who dived into the depths after an unfamiliar girl who decided to take her own life. Saving him, he pressed her so close to him that she touched his skin with her lips. After some time, Inez lay on the soft green grass, and the instructions of the goddess Hecrasia sounded in her head that the girl had obligations to her savior. The woman thought that she had died twice today. She was killed by the news of the death of her loved ones and destroyed by the waters of the lake, and was rescued twice, from prison and from underwater captivity. The guy, soaked from head to toe, looked at the former drowned woman sternly but calmly. Inside, the words from the letter still sounded, blaming the girl for the death of her relatives. But now Inez resisted them. She asked her inner voice to stop reproaching her for what she actually had nothing to do with. At some point, the woman suddenly caught the light and went towards it with an open soul. The light came from an unfamiliar guy who smiled, extended his hand, and called for him. And she joyfully moved forward to meet the stranger, because in her heart, the hope that had been extinguished flared up again. Perhaps he will be the one who can pull me out of this nightmare in which I found myself, Inez thought. Suddenly, someone called her name, and the girl suddenly woke up. She was lying on a clean bed, and her head was resting on a snow-white pillow. The stranger looked at Inez with concern and asked about the nightmares she had just had. The girl forcefully exhaled his name, Carson, and immediately her face became covered. She sat up on the bed and looked around, then thanked the guy for his concern and asked for. The cavalier replied that Inez should thank not only him, Carson von Raymond, the eighth prince. Inez was truly grateful to the prince and his servants for their efforts to restore her spirit and body. In addition, her nightmares, which tormented the woman throughout her 10 years in the dungeons of Romfield, this darkness was dispelled by the light that came from background Raymond and his actions, which, however, the guy believed that as long as even the slightest signs of past nightmares remained. And then the Lord asked the question that had haunted him all these days. Inez was a little confused by such directness and tried to find words, but it turned out to be not so easy. Lines from the letter and accusations about the death of her relatives immediately appeared in her head. Moreover, the woman was again overwhelmed by a wave of despair and hopelessness. This voice, driving her crazy and not allowing her to think normally, put more and more pressure on her psyche, forcing her to panic. It seemed as if something lived inside the girl and constantly insisted on the need to rid this world of her presence. Finally, the prince called her by name again and pulled her out of this internal stupor. It was clear that he did not want to rush her. The guy saw how difficult Inez's thought processes were, so he asked forgiveness. The girl thought that torturing herself with meaningless worries about what she had lost was but the attempt to bring herself to her senses was unsuccessful, and Carson reacted unusually calmly, only slightly surprised by what he heard. Inez froze for a moment. She suddenly became afraid of what her savior might think, but the prince, with a calm expression, advised to forget about the past and move on. However, here Inez flared up and accused the guy of insensitivity and indifference, to which von Raymond coldly remarked that this is her life. And suddenly the girl thought about the prince's words and realized that she was truly free. Images from the past were still flying through her thoughts, where she was not free, where she was unfairly accused and humiliated in every possible. Also, Inez will never be able to forget those long years that she spent in hellish prison. Her hand squeezed the sheet, and the last flashing thought stopped in her mind, that perhaps all this was for a reason, and it had its own purpose. And indeed, all these years she fought for life, set goals for herself, and even when she found, perhaps it was this thirst for life that led her from birth, allowing her to overcome unimaginable obstacles. And if this is so, it means that in everything that happened to her, there was. Sometime later, having recovered from mental and physical wounds, Inez found strength and visited the cemetery. Her clothes and shoes were completely wet, just like when she immersed herself in the waters of the lake, and finally the girl found the right tombstone among the gray, gloomy, and sad rows. She looked at the grave and could not even cry. Her soul was. It was the grave of her husband Joseph, whose death had caused so many innocent people to suffer. Inez looked at the wet, dark stone and remembered the day when she was slandered and tried, and then the subsequent 10 years of accusations and hard labor. Sometimes the thought even occurred to her that she had really killed her husband. You can't live in eternal torment, the former prisoner decided, and put her wedding ring on Joseph's wet. The symbol of her marriage, once out of the owner's hand, somehow immediately lost its former shine, becoming dull and inconspicuous. Memories came flooding back to Inez, and she was transported to the distant, distant past, when her life was full of happiness and joy. It was in the summer when Joseph proposed marriage to her, kneeling in the middle of a flowering landscape. But the past cannot be returned, and the woman's straight. Inez turned around and rushed away, promising herself that from that moment, having taken just a few steps, the girl immediately switched to current problems and thought that it would be nice to quickly get into a dry room. There was not a soul on the streets of the nearest settlement. No one wanted to leave the house in such inclement weather. Inez walked along the deserted pavements completely alone, only street lamps dimly illuminated. In the distance, the girl saw a young tall guy walking in the same direction. Having caught up with him, the woman glanced at his face and was literally dumbfounded. It was her late husband Joseph, on whose grave she had just left her wedding ring. But this cannot be, thought Inez, because he died many, many years ago. With a broken voice, she called out to the guy, and he turned around. But as soon as their gazes crossed, the stranger immediately ran away. And while the guy's silhouette kept moving away, the widow stood rooted to the spot. The unfortunate woman froze in the middle of the street in the pouring rain and frantically tried to figure out what had happened. Maybe it was all a hallucination in the sick imagination of a tired mind? But an inner voice insisted otherwise, that in front of her was Joseph, her husband, killed. Inez didn't even remember how she rushed to catch up with the fugitive, and came to her senses only when she finally caught up with. The guy stood on the other side of the street and seemed to be waiting for something. She took a step forward and called Joseph by name, who responded by calling her Inez. The girl resolutely walked towards the guy, continuing to ask questions as she walked. With every step, her words became harsher. She literally reproached her husband and the man still stood and smiled stupidly, did not take his eyes off her and watched as she approached. This smile confused Inez, and she slowed down, suspecting that something incomprehensible and inexplicable. Suddenly, the clatter of the cart's hooves distracted the girl's attention, and she only now realized that she was standing. The rider sharply reared his horse, and it rose high, high above the unwary traveler. Inez could not move and did not even take a step back, but simply stood and watched as heavy hooves with forged horseshoes hung over her. From a strong blow, the woman fell onto the hard and cold pavement. The rider immediately dismounted, but did not run to help the downed. On the side of the road, motionless, lay a wounded woman. Her hand was thrown back, and the same strange guy stood above her. Having come to her senses a little and overcoming the pain, Inez opened her eyes, flooded with tears and rain. She could not get up, but only extended her hand towards the man who stood next to her. In response, Inez heard rude swearing and regret. The scoundrel complained that there was still life in. The stranger, who looked exactly like Joseph, expressed extreme dissatisfaction with the fact that he could not kill the girl the first time. The man handed the bag of specie to the rider and thanked him for his efforts. After that, Joseph bent over the wounded woman, made a strange grimace, and called his ex-wife by name. And when he saw that the woman was still alive, he began to reproach her for the fact that he had to act out his own death. The former widow lay on the cold stone sidewalk, and bitter tears flowed down her cheeks, mixing with rain. At the end of his monologue of bile and irritation, it began to get dark in her eyes. Consciousness began to leave the unfortunate. The last thought that came to Inez before she completely lost consciousness was about humility. In the darkness of oblivion, the woman remembered the image of Carlos, who spoke of the freedom to choose. Inez remembered her parents and thought that she still wanted to live, but not just live, but live happily. A ray of light cut through the darkness and began to gradually return the girl's consciousness to reality. She woke up, opened her eyes wide, and tried to comprehend everything that she had seen before. The girl lay in a clean and soft bed, in a cold sweat, and tried to recover from this nightmare. The first thing Inez did was feel her own body, her clothes, and the crumpled blanket. Benoa clearly remembered how the carriage hit her, and this feeling of a heavy blow still did not leave her. Suddenly, a woman called out to the girl. It was her mother, and she called her daughter something that no one had called for a long time. Inez Svendon. That was her name before her marriage. Deciding that this was definitely a dream, the poor thing relaxed a little, because dreams are just dreams and there is no need to be afraid of them. The mother wiped the sweat from her daughter's forehead and asked where she went in such bad. The touch of my beloved mother was very pleasant, and long forgotten, because more than 10 years had passed since then. Svendin closed her eyes, trying to hold back the tears, and extended her fingers towards her mother's caring hand. Then, the daughter began to ask for forgiveness, and thick night had already fallen outside the window. The mother looked a little angry because the heiress of the family wouldn't stop crying and said stupid things, and then she left, saying that she would bring water. Inez immediately jumped up on the bed, afraid that her parent would come out and she wouldn't see her again. Svendin grabbed the edge of the mattress and tried to get up as quickly as possible. She didn't want this dream to end. The daughter sank to the floor with her bare foot and immediately froze in indecision. The girl realized that her foot no longer hurt and had no damage at all. Inez was completely fine, and this thought slowed down her movement and made her linger by. It was strange and surprising because Svendin had limped all her life. Even then the girl came to her senses because she wanted to catch up with her mother, and immediately, but there was a mirror against the wall, and after looking into it, Svendin even sat down when she saw her reflection, which seriously alarmed her mother, who returned to the room. The mother ran up to her daughter, asking why she jumped up so quickly that she could not stand on her feet. Inez looked at her reflection intently and in surprise, simultaneously feeling everything was very realistic, and even the mother was more alive than anyone. The face and body completely matched her condition many years ago, which was incredible. And the leg was healthy, not the slightest sign of lameness or any other ailment. When the mother approached her daughter, she heard a strange question about how old she was. The parent's answer was shocking, but explaining something. 39 years old? Svendin quickly figured that in this case she must now be 20 years old. On the table, richly decorated with all kinds of sweets, there was a teapot, and there were two people sitting at the table. The guy's name was Joseph, and the girl's name was Inez. The thoughts of the young, green-eyed person really were at that time somewhere far, far away. Joseph Bayona was once a simple villager, but his inner qualities helped the guy rise and receive, and just a year after the wedding, he tragically dies at the hands of his own wife. But there is another Joseph, whom not everyone knows, and many do not even. One day he nevertheless showed his true face and came out of the shadows, and he betrayed love, trampled the tender feelings of his loved one. Therefore, now Inez holds a cup of aromatic tea in her hands, laughs, and the guy sits opposite, blushes and turns pale, not understanding what happened and what he did. Joseph is glad that the girl suddenly pays attention to him, and even says that she was waiting for his. The guy remembers that his chosen one will soon have a birthday, and asks to give him some of her precious. Inez remembers well that Joseph proposed to her on her 20th birthday. The girl promises to give the guy a minute at her party. Inez watches as her admirer repeats exactly all the movements that he did on. Joseph is no longer a mystery to her, but rather a dusty book, once read and now reopened. The boyfriend thought of surprising the girl with the unexpected news that Inez from the past then jumped out of her chair and rushed to the guy as soon as she heard. Then naive Svendin hastened to share this joy with her chosen one. She was filled with, but that was in another life, and now the deceived wife wants to avoid mistakes. Inez from the present only laughed in response, and suggested that he leave quickly, because the guy probably had. The fan seems defeated, because he had pinned so many hopes on his promotion and status. But the girl doesn't even look in his direction. She just continues. Inez replies that she is not interested in details, because the status of knight in itself. The details are that Joseph became a knight in the family of Count Graham from Rossoni. Svendin was only now seriously thinking about how a poor man without status could get involved with such influential people. The guy caught her confusion and asked about its reasons. Apparently, this attitude greatly hurt Joseph, and he began asking leading questions. The girl avoided a direct answer, citing a large number of thoughts related to the upcoming. The fan was not satisfied with what was said, but did not insist further, and therefore turned around and walked. After waiting until Joseph was far enough away, Inez violently slammed a wave of barely restrained rage washed over her, and the world around. Of its own accord, The hand reached out to the table knife, and the girl thought that perhaps she should kill him right now. At that moment, her gaze was filled with hatred, and her heart with determination. A couple of moments later, Inez released the weapon from her hand, and the knife slid to the ground and fell into the short. Svendin realized that killing a cunning admirer was too easy. She needed to make him. Meanwhile, a reception for high-ranking persons was taking place in the emperor's palace, one of whom was the crown prince, who wished to leave the imperial family. The emperor was glad to learn that his adult son wanted to leave his father's care, and the empress told the ruler in which lands their influence was now lacking. These turned out to be the territories of Landhill. Taking advantage of his wife's advice, and while the empress smiled sweetly and fanned herself, her husband told his son that he needed to. Not wanting to object, the newly made Lord of Landhill humbly accepted the appointment. The empress also recommended that the heir visit his sister in Rasonia, in order, with the permission of her father, to take. The guy was glad that he would arrive at the property not alone, but with his sister, so he warmly thanked. Then the Lord of Landhyla rose and praised his father's empire, called Kainz. The imperial castle shocked with its beauty and decoration. The prince walked along the wide corridor and thought about what happened today, and that this day would become a turning point. He also recalled the advice that the empress gave to the ruler, from which it followed that the father was only a puppet in her hands. And this cunning woman. The young lord could not recover from the thought that his parent was being so openly pushed around. And it was also unpleasant for the prince to see what his parent had become, capable of making. The guy clenched his fist in anger. This situation clearly infuriated him. Carson remembered his sister, and thought that she was still a child and knew little about her family. And this knowledge was in the 3-story mansion of the Svendin family. Despite the inclement weather outside the window, the family was having dinner at a large table, and there was something peaceful about this meal. Now Inez looked at all this with completely different eyes, taking into account all. The parents were the same as before, eating and talking peacefully. The mother felt that her daughter had changed. At first she did. Looking straight into her daughter's eyes, the parent began to name. The father took the side of his daughter and simply attributed all the changes to the fact that the girl had finally begun to grow up. Inez, in turn, hastened to support her father's words and assured her mother that the girl listened to her mother's comments regarding the fact that the sharp growth occurred in just a couple of days. The head of the family interrupted the discussion and asked if his daughter was aware of the latest. Inez heard from her father that a new lord appointed by the emperor was coming to Landhill. The fact is that geographically the Svendin estate belonged to Rasonia. However, 35 years ago everything changed when, as a result of despite the difficulties that arose, vassal Svendin, and as a result, some tension arose between the players in the region, and the girl understood this very well. And while Inez continued dinner, her father told the latest news that a new ruler would soon appear in the lands of Land. This news shocked the daughter, since she knew this man very well, or rather, the girl inquired when the new ruler would visit his lands, and learned that his arrival was expected just of Carson, her savior. Such a strong, self-confident, and Inez immediately thought that it would be great if he came to her birthday. But what does the prince? And while the daughter thoughtfully examined her dinner on an exquisite, namely, she said that von Raymond would also visit Rasonia to pick up his prince. And then a long past episode from her past life, when she was still working in hard labor, one of the prisoners, named Helen, told her friend that this unpleasant conversation left a clear trace in Inez's memory, and the understanding. Moreover, Lena shared the secret that she had fulfilled her part of the deal and was now counting on. Could Inez condemn the unfortunate murderer, driven to despair by blackmail? Sitting in warmth and comfort, devouring a hot dinner, a young Svendin continued to recall memories of bygone days and could she trust the words of the convict Helena, or was it the figment of. Indeed, Inez remembered that her friend sometimes showed signs of madness. But if we assume that the information is true, it means that Helen killed this same princess, Carson's sister. Dinner ended and Svendin moved to her room, continuing. Inez allowed the girl to enter and looked at her questioningly. The maid brought a message from Joseph, who was now called Sir Joseph. In a short letter, the guy congratulated the object of his attention on his anniversary and asked. Despite the rain and inclement weather, Joseph wanted to see each other. The note was brought by Susan, the same girl whose letter literally killed Inez's desire. With a sly smile, Mrs. Svendin called out to the maid and asked if she thought this. The maid turned pale and in a broken voice asked to clarify what exactly in the message Inez found so unpleasant. To this, the young heiress responded with a fit of anger, crumpled the letter and pointed. Episodes from her imprisonment quickly came to mind, in which the girl ended. Inez also remembered well the events of the last night from the future, when the horseman bribed by Joseph killed her with the hook. Svendin remembered his smiling face as the scoundrel watched with pleasure. And now, here and now, this traitor continues to make insidious plans for her. The next moment, Inez realized that she really wanted him dead. And only when her enemy is destroyed will the girl be able to rest and calm down. Turning to Susan, who was frozen in anticipation, the lady finally said that she agreed to the meeting. Looking after the retreating maid, Inez thought that Joseph. After all, if you remember the trial, many people gave evidence, and they all lied, which this means that as soon as she gets out of the nets set by. The young lady thought that the only way to avert the misfortune looming over her family was. Inez turned to the window and began to watch how heavy drops of rain flowed down the transparent glass. Young Miss Svendin will continue to fight and try to win. Inez sat on the bed, listened to the sound of the rain outside the window, and lined up in her head possible steps that should lead her to success in this difficult event. The clouds cleared, and the bright sun appeared outside the window. The man who is young Svendin had high hopes. There was Carson, her savior and eighth prince. At a critical moment, the guy extended his hand to Inez, and risking himself, his silhouette, which the drowning woman saw in moments of mortal danger, was approaching, and the fact that von Raymond reappeared on the horizon of her life gave Inez support under her feet. And a beautiful summer day, green foliage and flower-covered bushes, Inez greeted Joseph cordially and smiled sweetly. She was truly in high spirits. The guy modestly approached and expressed his joy at their meeting. Young Svendin returned the favor and also noted that the rain had stopped just in time. The sly man reached into his inner pocket and pulled out an envelope. Joseph cleared his throat and said that he had written a letter for the girl. Inez smiled mysteriously and invited the guy to read his letter out loud. The fan immediately agreed and expressed hope that the lines of the message would be able to convey the whole. And while the boyfriend was reading his creation, the girl looked at him intently and remembered these lines. In the letter, Joseph mentioned her luxurious golden locks of hair like the radiance of stars. He talked about the captivating look of bright green eyes that attract attention. It was a truly beautiful, sincere letter, the kind that people. Once upon a time, in another life, the young and. At the end of the message, Joseph confessed his love to the girl, and again, the sly man spoke solemnly and confidently. It was clear that he had been prepared. Then the guy got down on one knee and continued his performance. An open velvet box appeared in his hand, where a wedding ring rested on a soft stand. The same. Inez knew this decoration very well, and once treasured it, because, despite the difficult conditions of imprisonment, covering her face with her hand, the girl whispered his name, depicting delight and surprise. Joseph received this display of emotion with undisguised joy, and smiled widely. Inez Svendin leaned on the table and slowly rose from her chair. The young lady leaned forward and extended her hand to the guy standing on his knee. And the next moment she covered the open box with her palm and lightly pressed the. Joseph was shocked by this act. He looked pitiful and unhappy because all his hopes and plans collapsed in. Inez answered evasively with a question when asked if she could refuse a guy like him. The fan was a little confused, but the girl dispelled his misunderstanding, saying that Joseph was still on one knee and did not understand what was happening. He asked for clarification of the. Young Svendin reported that her family received a marriage proposal from a wealthy noble family. Suddenly, Inez bent down, took the failed groom by the hands and asked him to calm down. She told the guy that she would definitely refuse this offer, and then his face began to shine again and his eyes filled with joy. And then the young lady hinted that everything could not be resolved so easily. And these words, Svendin noted that she needed time to convince her father, who would definitely be against marrying a former poor man. The fan humbly lowered his head and asked only how long he would remain in agonizing anticipation. But green-eyed Inez did not even think of reassuring the sly man, but only once again avoided answering. The young lady slyly suggested that the status of a knight would allow Joseph to prove himself and rise to the level of baron. The guy was extremely puzzled, because it could take him years of hard work to reach a new rank. In response to this objection, Inez asked with surprise how she would live married to a man from a... Joseph was depressed, embarrassed and puzzled at the same time. His face showed the sad grimace of a man who... All this time the girl carefully watched the admirer. Now he was her victim, whom Inez understood perfectly well that the guy... And this powerful puppeteer is capable of raising a person from the very bottom with one wave of his hand and giving him a real title. The behind-the-scenes villain was even able to turn... And as a result of this stream of slander, the Svendin family was destroyed and trampled, and someone received a certain benefit from this. Seeing Joseph hesitate, Inez pressed him, reminding him of his recent declaration of love. And without giving the guy time to come to his senses, according to all indirect signs, it turned out that the orderer of this betrayal was none other than Count Graham. Realizing that he was on the verge of an abyss, Joseph rushed to the girl and literally... The guy tried to find words to prove his sincerity and depth of feeling. Inez was a little taken aback by this action and tried to free her hand, but it turned out to be not so easy. When the girl finally managed to break free from Joseph's tenacious grip, she smiled sweetly and agreed with the arguments of the heated groom. Young Svendin promised that she would delay the conversation with her parents regarding the marriage for as long as she could. But then the girl took the box with the engagement ring for herself, citing the fact that she did not want to part with it. Previously, the wedding decoration was a symbol of love and devotion for Inez, but now it became a victory trophy. The conversation was completed. It went differently than in the previous life, and before leaving, the young lady stayed for a while. Svendin looked closely at Joseph. He looked confused and a little pitiful. Inez asked the guy whether he thought of himself as a man of knighthood or still thought in terms of the lower class. As soon as the fan heard these words, he immediately fell into a stupor, from which, poorly understanding what was happening and not moving, the boyfriend asked to clarify the question. For a while, they looked each other straight in the eyes and simply... Then the girl got bored with this silent dialogue. It was noticeable that she did not want to answer anything. Continuing to maintain silence, the young mistress turned around and left the lawn, and there was no love and joy among the images in Joseph's head, but only dull anger, rage, and hate. Inez called Susan behind her and asked the maid to hurry up, since Carson von... The frightened girl obeyed the will of the mistress and asked how Inez knew about this unusual path, along which they were walking. So young Svendin really navigated this area well. Her steps were firm. She answered the maid that she had already been here once. And indeed, soon the girls passed a group. The amazed maid asked when this was, to which the mistress briefly said that these were things of long ago. Susan decided not to pester Inez with her questions anymore, and continued to... The maid chose to change the subject and asked why the young lady was so interested in the new lord's visit to Risonia. The answer she heard literally shook the maid to the core, because Svendin assumed that The young lady thought for a moment. She understood her companion's confusion. After all, just the other day, a man with the status of a knight asked for her hand. The girl was a little worried by the fact that since their last meeting, when she had really provoked Svendin was less concerned about the enemy's new plans than the need to see a possible ally. Inez thought that Carson should now be a little over 20 years old, which the solemn procession of carts slowly approached their destination. The column was headed by a prince sitting astride a bay stallion. The guy seemed thoughtful and sad. Carson was deep in thought about his little sister, whom he wanted to take away from this. Von Raymond gritted his teeth at the fact that this journey had taken him so long. When the heir to the throne was only 15 years old, his dear and beloved mother died. The former empress was given small doses of poison for a long time, which gradually accumulated in the body, and at some point it was no mystery to members of the imperial family who exactly was behind this crime. But in the end, the matter was... And all these years, the little prince grew up realizing that the killer was very close. When Carson turned 17, his younger sister was given to the Lord of Risonia, Earl Grey. The young prince really wanted to prevent this event, but was absolutely devoid of influence, and the ability... Little Louis didn't want to go anywhere, much less to part with her brother. But the new empress diligently removed. The count, on the contrary, was clearly glad to have such a valuable. The little princess tried to escape, cried and begged to be left at home with her brother. But Gray did not care about the feelings and emotions of others. He was more interested in his plans and personal gain. The man tried to convince the girl that she should take the situation more seriously. Carson stood up for his sister and tried to prevent her immediate departure from the imperial palace. And realizing that the event was inevitable, the young prince began to threaten the count with revenge and reprisals if but the man only laughed when he heard such threats and expressed categorical disagreement with Carson. The count mentioned that this was an order from the empress, who, wanting to express her love, Graham also said that he has certain family ties with the current mistress of the palace. Finally, the man recommended that the young man behave more decently, as befits his level and status. The count then threatened the empress with wrath and headed to his carriage. The cunning man knew that Carson had nothing to argue with him and used the available power and influence to carry out the plan outlined by the empress. Looking into the tear-stained eyes of his sister, the young prince promised that he would make every effort to rescue her as soon as Carson asked Louisiana to wait patiently for him and take care of herself. The girl promised to follow her brother's recommendations and wait for their reunion. The prince responded to his sister with a reciprocal gesture, and this touching moment was forever. From that moment on, the young man focused on taking. Quite quickly, the young prince's fortune grew to a significant level, and when Carson felt real strength in himself, supported by untold riches, and he was about 21 years old at that time, he began to act. First of all, the prince went to the imperial chambers to get the approval of the empress, because no important matter could pass by this insidious woman. Hearing of the king's son's desire to become Lord of Landhill, his mother's killer became thoughtful. The mistress of the palace read his petition for some time and tried to find a catch in it. Carson said that in exchange for her consent, he was ready to give up money and even his status as heir to the throne. The woman came to the conclusion that this agreement would benefit her and responded positively. Suddenly, the empress looked intently at her stepson straight in the eyes, trying to read his true motives. But Carson was already a very experienced person and therefore remained calm and cool. Satisfied with this check, the woman continued to drink expensive wine from the glass and promised to convey Carson's message to the emperor. Finally, the cheat noticed that the guy had really changed in recent years and had done a lot of work. And this was true, because there was no trace left of the defenseless and weak boy who accompanied his sister to Rosonia. Now before us was a wise and experienced ruler. The clatter of many horse hooves echoed throughout the surrounding area and frightened the local birds. The entourage informed Carson that the end of their journey to Landhill was near, as there was still quite a bit to go. The Lord's servant noted that they arrived at their destination very quickly, in just 4 days, given their hasty departure from the palace. Von Raymond exhaled noisily and smiled. He was pleased to know that he would soon accomplish his plan. Continuing to break into a smile, Carson noted that he had been waiting for this moment for 4 long years. So 4 days for him was just a drop in the bucket. While Inez and Susan walked along the road to the square, the lady asked the maid about the number of people who had gathered to see the new lord, and she answered that his arrival had caused a real stir. People said that von Raymond worked very hard from a very young age and therefore reached the height of his position, and in addition, his charismatic appearance helped him achieve his goals. Inez thought that winning the attention of young Carson, the public's favorite, would not be so easy. Susan ended her story about the prince's virtues with the phrase that every girl should keep his portrait, and then Svendon asked the maid to get his image. In response to the maid's surprise, the girl folded her hands and said that she did not want to lag behind the others, and she simply needed a portrait of the Lord, at least small in size. The confused companion promised to fulfill the order, since her mistress showed such open interest in the Lord's person. Inez replied that this was not idle curiosity, and then hurried to the nearest turn. Young Svendon was attracted by an unusual noise coming from around the corner. She saw a picture of a young woman furiously arguing about something with a tall man in a dark hood. Inez recognized her almost immediately. It was the same Helen, a casual acquaintance from the Romfield dungeon, who claimed to have killed a member of the imperial family in exchange for the life of her boyfriend. Young Inez looked at her former cellmate with all her eyes, and images of bygone days arose in her head. Helen showed certain signs of madness while they were still in the same dungeon, and talked a lot about her boyfriend Jason, whom she loved. Now the woman, of course, looked better, and the clothes she was wearing were clearly not those of a dungeon prisoner. But something unpleasant still appeared in her gaze. Leaning around the corner, Inez watched the dialogue between Helen and her unknown companion, hiding his face. The stranger was definitely trying to convince the girl of something, and even force her to do something. The young lady greedily absorbed fragments of phrases that reached her, and tried to understand the situation while in hiding. Susan, clearly frightened and acting on the principle, "The less you know, the better you sleep," tried to distract Inez. However, young Svendin herself wanted to be as far away from her past as possible, but Helen's mysterious story was still swirling in her head. Walking away, the girl thought about what she saw and tried to understand who this man was and what he needed from her friend. The companions walked the rest of the way to the exit from the underground passage in silence, each thinking about her own. Finding herself in a lively city crowd gathered in the square, Susan quickly switched gears. But Inez's thoughts were still there, in a dark and gloomy corner, next to Elena. Svendin recalled the convict's story about premeditated murder, and wondered whether these words could be true. Inez didn't know any details, but she did remember that Helen was clutching a red ribbon in her hand. The area was noisy and full of people who had come from all over the area to see the famous man and the new Lord Landhill live. The thought flashed in the girl's head that perhaps the crime that the prisoner was talking about should be committed today, when Carson planned to take his sister from the clutches of the Count. Inez clutched her hand, wondering what she could do and who she could warn, since she had no direct evidence. Fear constrained her movements, because she could make a mistake and only ruin her new life, which she so wanted to live correctly and with meaning. Heavy thoughts gripped the fragile girl, and her inner voice began to ask uncomfortable questions, like who would believe her words, and what would happen to her next. Svendin was brought out of this state by a stately woman who asked him to give way to her. Stepping aside, Inez suddenly saw a teenage girl right in front of her, with a familiar red ribbon woven into her hair. Looking at the baby, the girl saw familiar facial features, vaguely reminiscent of Carson. It was definitely his sister Louisiane, for whom the prince was about to arrive. The girl walked accompanied by a maid, protecting the crown lady from random passers-by. Still not believing her eyes, Inez, as if spellbound, followed the elusive red ribbon with her eyes. Finally, she came to her senses and extended her hand after the departing heiress to the throne. But at that moment, the crowd closed in and shielded them from the hesitating Svendin silhouette of a teenager. Inez rushed forward to try to catch up with the woman and the princess. Suddenly, the young lady was stopped by a tall young guy who blocked her way and told her that she couldn't come any closer. Soon, an impressive procession of horsemen, carriages, and servants appeared, led by a young lord on horseback. It was him, the same Carson whom Inez remembered and rightfully considered her savior. His confident, calm face was hard not to recognize. At some distance stood the maid and her ward, Princess Louisiane. Svendin did not know what to do in such a situation, but she felt that it was necessary to act quickly and decisively, because the killer could appear at any moment. Meanwhile, the procession of horsemen was approaching closer and closer to the final point of the route. Passers-by and onlookers surrounding Inez began to discuss someone standing on the opposite side of the street. It was a lone horsewoman, with her head covered by a low hood, so her face could not be seen. The guard closest to the stranger made a threatening gesture with a spear and demanded the woman to identify herself. However, the rider continued her silent movement forward, despite threats from the event security. Her long blonde hair hung from under her clothes and reminded the young mistress of someone. Judging by the trajectory of her movement, the stranger was heading straight towards Princess Louis and the woman accompanying her. But the guard who stood between them blocked the path, and then the rider sharply pulled on the reins. The horse reared up, obeying the strict order of its mistress. The guard with the polearm could not do anything against the heavy hooves of the stallion and only tried to defend himself. Having eliminated this temporary obstacle, the stranger spurred her horse and rushed like a whirlwind towards her goal. The hood flew off her head, revealing white curls of hair. Now it could be said with confidence that Helen was planning a murder on this very day. Svendin instantly recognized her former cellmate and immediately imagined the terrible consequences of the atrocity she was planning. The girl also noticed that the desperate woman was rushing at full speed towards the young princess. But Louisiana does not notice anything. She has been waiting for her brother for so long that she cannot think about anything other than the upcoming meeting. Inez decides to act, because literally every second counts. The horse is getting closer and closer. She pushes away the guard and breaks forward. Having gathered all the strength of her young but fragile body, the girl rushes onto the roadway. A few meters separate Inez from Louisiana, and she rushes across the rushing killer right under the horse's hooves. Full of determination and in a furious impulse, the girl wants to change the past and prevent the commission of a crime. At this moment, the killer realizes that a new obstacle has arisen on her path, which could interfere with her terrible plan. At the last second, the young mistress manages to rush forward and cover the young princess with her body. The scarlet ribbon could not stay in the black hair of its little mistress and flew away. And then a bright strip of fabric fell to the ground, and no one paid attention to it anymore. Inez lay on the hard slabs of the stone pavement and covered the girl pressed against her with her arms. The girl felt her body weakly, but most of all her leg hurt in the foot area. When trying to move, the painful sensations intensified and became so strong that young Svendin closed her eyes. Her head was broken and aching, but gathering her will into a fist, Inez looked at the girl and asked how she was feeling. The princess was scared, covered in bruises and in tears, but definitely alive. The girl did not answer, but her look said much more than words could express. Svendin assured the little girl that she was not in danger and tried to stand up, leaning on her hand. A horse was rampaging nearby, which someone cunning and daring planned to turn into a murder weapon. Helen was also nearby. The guards were just at that moment tying her hands behind her back, although she was struggling and screaming. Then she turned and furiously attacked Inez, blaming the wounded girl for preventing her from carrying out her evil plan. The young mistress looked at her former cellmate and thought that she used to feel sorry for Helen. Inez covered Louisiana's ears with her hands and asked the girl not to listen to this stream of anger and rudeness. Svendin suggested that they go to her brother, Lord Landhill, as soon as possible. But after taking a couple of steps, Inez suddenly felt that her strength was rapidly leaving her body, and her vision was becoming foggy. The clear picture of the surrounding world began to blur and darken. The girl really didn't want to lose consciousness, and she tried to fight the weakness that came over her. Overcoming pain and dizziness, Inez nevertheless continued on her way, thinking that to some extent she was able to repay Carson for his action, for pulling her out of the lake. The prince gave her a second life, thanks to which she learned so much and lived a decent life. The girl walked, leaving behind her a bloody trail on the pavement, and remembered the words of the goddess Hecrasia, that the result of excessive desires is always emptiness. And then the image of her savior appeared in front of Inez. He was dressed in a ceremonial uniform and surrounded by air bubbles. It was a very unexpected sight that made her bright green eyes widen. Obeying an inner impulse, the girl extended her hand forward, as she did then, sinking into the depths of the lake. The brush weakened, and the world around gradually plunged into greenish darkness. And it happened again. A strong male hand took her wrist and squeezed it tightly. The prince arrived in time and tried to keep Inez on her feet, although it was not easy. Carson asked about her well-being. It was clear how worried he was, although outwardly he tried to remain calm. In a weakening voice, the wounded Svendin said his name and looked Carson straight in the eyes with a long, unblinking gaze. Inez wanted to say something else about the little princess, but at that moment, she felt that her strength was running out. Lord Landhila tried to catch the falling body of his sister's savior. After some time, events moved to an estate made of light stone. A tall, stately guy walked along the red carpet and thought that as soon as the walls of the imperial palace were left far behind, misfortunes befell him. Carson understood that his move could lead to various consequences, but he could not even imagine that his opponents would get to them so quickly. And if it weren't for that woman who risked her life and threw herself under a horse, it is unknown whether she and Louis would have been together or not. But that's not all, because the prince also became the target of attack by several mercenaries at once. Masked strangers blocked Carson's path and were ready to kill him at the first opportunity if he tried to intervene and save his sister. The guy even tried to enter into a dialogue with them so that they would let him pass. But the leader of the thugs refused to obey von Raymond, mentioning that he was carrying out someone's orders. Carson knew that there were other laws besides the power of titles and recognized leaders, but he did not expect to meet their followers so soon. The guy hastily left the saddle, determined to pave the way to his sister at any cost. The young lord understood that the new mistress of the imperial palace was behind all this, and when she dared to touch his dear Louis and send mercenaries, she crossed the last line. Cold rage and a sharp blade became his word and deed. thanks to which the distance between Carson and the little princess was reduced with each swing of the sword. The battle was hot and fleeting, but in the end, only the new Lord of Landhill remained standing on the stone pavement. Von Raymond removed the obstacle in his path and rushed towards Louisiana. The girl was being led by an unknown young girl. She was limping and looked bad, all beaten, bruised, and with bleeding wounds on her body. The prince quickened his pace, and after a couple of seconds he was already near his sister and the stranger. Everything was clearly all right with the girl, which cannot be said about the girl. Judging by her appearance, she had a hard time. Carson saw this face for the first time. Otherwise, he would have definitely remembered her delicate features and bright green eyes. The prince hesitated for a moment, peering at this image and trying to remember at least someone similar, but in vain. Finally, the guy realized that the girl was getting worse and was about to fall. The stranger's eyes actually began to slowly close, and some kind of fatigue appeared in her movements. But Carson, fascinated by her beauty and the sacrifice of her act, was in a certain daze. For a moment, it seemed to the lord that everything around had disappeared and only the two of them were left. The prince walked along the red carpet and stopped at a high door. Carefully opening the high doors, Carson looked inside the room. She was lying on the bed, the savior of his beloved sister, and at the same time the girl who had captivated the prince's mind. Carson thought that now that the stranger had been cleaned up and her wounds had been treated, she looked much younger than on the day they first met. Then there was no living space on her, and due to this, the savior seemed older. But the prince was interested in another question. Why the girl risked her life for the sake of his sister? Because they were strangers. At this moment, the stranger lying on the bed began to slowly open her large green eyes. Inez saw that Carson was standing opposite her and their eyes met. The guy was glad that the girl came to her senses right now. Then he inquired about her well-being. Young Svendin sat up in bed and was surprised to call von Raymond by name. Then, the girl began to look around, trying to figure out where she was. The voiced answer somewhat embarrassed the young mistress when she learned that after losing consciousness, she was urgently taken to Lord Landhill's castle. Inez was sure that life had left her body, but it turned out that Carson saved her once again. But what then did the image of the prince underwater, which she saw immediately before fainting, mean? Trying to sort out her last memories, the girl went deep into thought and forgot that a patient prince was sitting in the chair in front of her. Finally, Inez came to her senses and asked about Louisiana's health, to which she received an answer that reassured her. Carson also noted that the girl she saved visited the wounded woman several times, but she was sleeping, to which the girl smiled. Expressing her joy at this, Svendin tried to get up and said that she needed to hurry home. But as soon as Inez stepped on her injured leg, she immediately felt a serious attack of pain that constrained her movements. The lord rushed to the rescue and helped the girl maintain her balance, and then sat her back on the bed. The guy warned that the wounds bled heavily, so she lost a lot of blood. And then he added that now it's better not to get up at all, but to gain strength, otherwise dizziness and weakness will only worsen the situation. Having laid the girl back on the bed, Carson remembered the doctor's recommendation, who advised peace and minimal stress, to which Inez agreed. But most of all, the young lady was worried about her ankle, because in fact, an old injury from a past life had returned to her, albeit in such an unusual way. The prince sympathized with her pain, but suggested that it was only a temporary inconvenience that would definitely pass, and the girl agreed with him, but she had a feeling that everything would be different. Von Raymond looked at Louis's savior and analyzed his feelings. It must be admitted that they were very different from what he had experienced before. Usually, the prince always managed to maintain self-confidence and composure, but being next to this girl, everything changed. Carson was brought out of his reverie by Svendin's question about the fate of the rider who wanted to knock down his sister on a horse. The guy was silent for some time, collecting his thoughts and considering his answer. Then von Raymond said that she was captured and taken into custody, but his people had not yet been able to find out who she was. Inez remembered Helen, her crazy eyes and the overheard dialogue with the stranger, and these thoughts made her feel unwell. Images of the past began to flash before the green eyes. They replaced each other and reminded of a past life. Romfield prisoner talked about the death of a man from the imperial family at her hands and shook the red ribbon of Louisiana in the air. Helen said that the Lord of Rissonia promised her a deal, the life of her boyfriend in exchange for the death of a member of a noble family, which means this whole attempt was the work of Count Graham, a relative of the Empress. If she and Carson can expose and bring this scoundrel to light, then everyone will only benefit from this, so thought young Mrs. Svendon. This chance should definitely be taken advantage of, the girl thought. Inez turned to the prince and asked an unexpected question about whether she could see the captured criminal. Von Raymond was sincerely surprised by such a strange desire and asked why she needed it. Svendon lowered her eyes and said that she wanted to help in the investigation, since this girl seemed familiar to her. The prince replied that the attacker was imprisoned, and if the girl had any information, he was ready to listen to it immediately. But Inez decided to avoid a direct answer and not tell Carson the whole story, and only said out loud that she still doubted it, so she needed to see the writer in person to confirm her guesses. This behavior seemed illogical to the guy, because seeking a meeting with his possible killer is, to say the least, very strange. And when young Svendon began to hastily give up her position and say in a trembling voice that she did not insist on this date at all, Carson became suspicious. Over the years of living in the palace, the prince learned to distinguish between lies and understatement, and therefore had a good understanding of people, and without listening to the girl's explanation, the guy got up from his chair. The Lord suddenly became interested in where this story would lead, and he agreed to support Inez's initiative to see the mysterious criminal. The young lady was a little taken aback by such a sudden change in the prince's mood. Von Raymond turned around and left, finally saying that he would think about a meeting in prison a little later. For a moment the guy lingered in the doorway. He literally felt the confused Inez looking at him. And before turning the knob and finally leaving the room, Carson said one more thing. It turns out that the prince has already spoken with the head of the Svendon family, so the father and mother are aware of the condition of their daughter, and Carson also added that she can remain on his estate until she fully recovers. The girl was clearly not ready for such information, and felt helpless and confused, sitting on the bed in Lord Landhill's mansion. Left alone, Inez was finally able to calm down and relax, because she managed to perform two significant actions at once: save little Louis, and also attract the attention of the prince. In the beautiful and rich mansion of Lord Rissonia, the days passed quickly, and the week flew by almost unnoticed. Carson, as usual, worked a lot with papers and was only occasionally distracted by extraneous thoughts, because large capital required constant control. Von Raymond remembered the blonde sitting in prison, who tried to take away the most precious thing in his life, his sister, but the villainess never admitted to anything. The criminal only insisted that that day she was under the influence of intoxicating drugs, and therefore could not remember anything. And even those mercenaries who blocked the Lord's path, and whom he was forced to chop with his sword, could not shed light on this story, since when the prince's people searched their bodies, they found nothing. Carson was regularly reported on the progress of the investigation, but the reports did not contain any new evidence or leads. Raymond knew that serious results required time and patience, but he was still annoyed that the matter had stalled. And then the prince remembered about the girl who had been in his mansion for a week. Her name was Inez, and by origin she was the heiress of Viscount Svendon. Nothing more remarkable and unusual could be found out. A simple girl from a poor, albeit noble family of a local landowner, who had a very modest allotment. But where does such a simple person have so much strength and desire to risk everything for a stranger, even a princess? And where did the heiress Svendon learn to endure pain, injury, and serious injuries so steadfastly? This beautiful and young girl raised more questions in Carson than answers, and remained a very mysterious person for him. The Lord's train of thought was interrupted by a knock on the door, when an assistant announced that Mrs. Svendon wished to speak with him. Without raising his head, the prince replied that he did not object to her visit, and was ready to give his guest time. His hand froze on another document, and the question of who Inez really was and what was hidden behind this pretty appearance was spinning in his head. This personality haunted von Raymond all these days, from their first meeting, because everything he knew about people until now did not fit into the image of the young savior. But more than others, the prince was worried about the fact that when she appeared, he felt something inexplicable, and this worried the guy. Quiet steps young Swandon entered Lord Landhill's office. Despite the persistent pain in her leg, Inez curtsied respectfully towards the prince. The observant Carson usually did not miss any details when communicating with other people. Therefore, the Lord noticed that the girl's leg was still not fine, because the swelling did not subside. Once again, von Raymond was amazed at how steadfastly the heiress Svenden endured pain, because during the movement she did not limp at all. The guy was used to seeing prim and cutesy girls in the palace, showing emotions with or without reason. Therefore, the steadfastness and composure with which the savior of Louisiana behaved in life pleasantly surprised Carson. The prince left the work table and went to the dining room, where one could not only conduct important negotiations, but also just have a nice conversation. His assistant was also in the room. The owner of Landhill pushed back his chair, and with a polite gesture invited the girl to sit at the opposite end of the table. Sitting in front of a large, beautiful fireplace decorated with swords, the lord inquired about the guest's health. The guy was especially interested in the condition of her leg. Inez replied that she was fine and the recovery process was almost complete. But Carson continued to insist and suggested that maybe the girl was still experiencing some discomfort. However, young Svenden turned out to be unshakable. Looking at the tea set on the table, she confirmed her words and assured the prince that thanks to his efforts, her health was safe. The young lady asked if she could return to her home now that her wounds had healed. She once again thanked von Raymond's people for their care, and said that she really missed her family, whom she had not seen for so long. Heiress Svenden, sitting at the high chair, felt like a hostage in the lord's mansion, and decided not to remember her offer to meet with Helen so as not to prolong the situation. Carson was silent for a moment, then took a sip of tea from a beautiful porcelain cup, seeming to be waiting for something. Having placed the container with the aromatic and strong drink on the saucer, the prince replied that he did not dare to keep Inez on his estate any longer, but made a reservation. Lord Landhyla turned to his personal assistant and remarked that it would be indecent to let such a brave girl go without due gratitude. Carson then recalled that young Svenden saved the person who was dearest and closest to him, his beloved sister Louisiana. Inez blushed and became embarrassed. She began to assure the prince that there was nothing special in her action, and anyone would have done the same. The owner added that with her noble deed, the girl had made a lot of enemies among the imperial elite. This message made the young lady worry. The savior took the papers from the assistant's hands and began to look through them. Carson added that she could choose anything from this list. The list of possible privileges that fell into the hands of Inez was quite impressive. The prince asked the girl to read slowly, so as not to miss something important, but the young Svenden immediately replied that she already knew what she wanted and was ready to make the final choice. Looking up at the lord, the young lady said that she wanted to obtain the right of immunity, which gives the holder immunity from prosecution. Carson was quite surprised by such an unexpected and quick decision. Usually people in such rare situations chose land or other material assets, but Inez was special. The lord smiled at the thought that he was not mistaken about the girl. She could not be read like an open book. Rather, there was an encrypted manuscript in front of him. Von Raymond crossed his arms over his chest and, laughing, asked what kind of sin she was planning, because the Svenden family belongs to noble blood, and nobles are rarely tried anyway. Carson invited the young lady to think again, but the girl said that this was the only thing she needed from the list. The prince, however, did not think of giving up. Looking at the beautiful swords above the fireplace, he repeated his question about the purpose of such a choice, but with some pressure. After thinking a little, Inez replied that a situation might arise when she would kill a person with her own hands. The lord looked puzzled. He clearly did not expect that this fragile young beauty could even think about such a serious crime. Suddenly the guy realized that he had been silent for too long and tried to correct himself as quickly as possible. Clearing his throat, the prince smiled and, looking at this mysterious girl with a smile, admitted that he had never expected to hear such an answer. Next, von Raymond pointed to her thin and delicate hands, noting that they were unlikely to be capable of doing anything terrible. Young Svenden countered the remark, saying that she had no such plans. But life is such that it can present a surprise at any moment, and it is better if she is ready for it. Carson agreed with the unpredictability of fate and the future as such, and noted that the right of immunity does not provide absolute immunity. The girl's hands trembled slightly, but Inez suppressed her excitement and replied that she simply really did not want to end up in Romfield. After these words, the former prisoner remembered the dirty, uncomfortable prison cells, the eternal twilight, and the inhuman conditions of hard labor. And again the young lady surprised her interlocutor with her statement. He knew a little about this place, a prison in the Rasonia region. The girl added that this is not just a dungeon, this is a real hell on earth. Then her face became covered with cold sweat. Inez immediately caught herself and noted that she had heard many heartbreaking stories about Romfield prisoners. But then her voice began to tremble, and the girl asked the prince for a promise that if she did commit a crime, she would be able to avoid this terrible place and would not bring harm to her family. Carson cupped his chin with 2 fingers and thought deeply. He knew there was some kind of dark story hidden here. The owner of Landhill turned to his assistant named Noah and asked to fulfill exactly the wishes of their guest, to which the servant nodded affirmatively and began to write something down in a notebook. Inez again attracted the attention of the men and asked to talk about her family. Heiress Svendin said that she wanted to speak with Carson as the Lord of Landhill, and, having received approval, continued. The problem expressed by the young lady was that, despite the geographical proximity to Landhill, her family was still subordinate to Rasonia when conducting business. Von Raymond looked at the assistant in surprise and asked to comment on the situation. Noah replied that the neighboring province had a large area and a small population, so Lord Grey was accustomed to making extreme demands of his vassals. The character of this cruel ruler has long been known to the residents, and therefore no one dares to argue with him or resist him. After listening to the brief report, Carson tensed. A righteous rage flashed in his eyes. Then the Lord pulled himself together and replied that he would put an end to this practice. Then the prince added that he fully supported the Svendin's desire to get rid of the oppression of Rasonia, but the issue could not be resolved quickly, since the intervention of the emperor was required. Inez was very happy when their new lord promised to stop Graham's encroachments on their family business. The girl expressed words of sincere gratitude, and her face lit up with happiness. Carson was also glad that there would be one less problem on the lands under his control. Suddenly, young Svendin's face changed and asked how the investigation into the attempted murder of Louisiana was going. Inez also recalled the horsewoman who had been sitting in prison for a long time. The young lady thought that Helen's psyche must have been completely shaken due to the circumstances.